The storm within. There are moments when the inner world becomes a battlefield, when conflicting desires tear at each other, when contradictory beliefs clash without resolution, when emotions rage in directions that reason cannot control. The mind becomes turbulent, fragmented, at war with itself. Thoughts spiral without landing anywhere. Feelings shift and contradict. The sense of self that usually feels coherent suddenly fractures into pieces that do not fit together. This is inner chaos, and it is one of the most disorienting and terrifying experiences of human consciousness. Inner chaos is not the same as external chaos. External chaos involves circumstances beyond our control: loss, crisis, sudden change, traumatic events. Inner chaos is different. It originates within the psyche itself, in the conflicts between different parts of ourselves, in the eruption of unconscious material that consciousness cannot integrate, in the breakdown of the psychological structures that usually keep us coherent and functional. This chaos can be subtle or overwhelming. It might be the vague sense that nothing feels right, that you do not recognize yourself, that your usual ways of being no longer work. Or it might be acute crisis, panic attacks that come from nowhere, depression that descends without clear cause, rage that erupts disproportionately, the sense that you are falling apart and cannot hold yourself together. Carl Jung understood that inner chaos is often not pathology but process, not breakdown but breakthrough attempting to happen, not destruction but the psyche's effort to reorganize itself at a higher level of integration. What feels like falling apart may be the necessary dissolution that precedes transformation, the chaos that comes before new order emerges. But this does not make it less frightening or less difficult to endure. Understanding inner chaos requires exploring why the psyche fragments, what triggers these internal storms, how chaos relates to growth, and how we can navigate turbulence without being destroyed by it. The nature of inner chaos. When the psyche fractures. Inner chaos emerges when the psychological structures that usually organize consciousness break down, when the defenses that keep the unconscious contained fail, when the persona we present to the world no longer fits who we are becoming, when the self-concept we have relied upon no longer holds together. This breakdown is not random. It follows patterns, has triggers, reveals something about how the psyche organizes itself and what happens when that organization becomes untenable. The psyche, in Jung's understanding, is naturally multiple, containing different aspects that often have conflicting goals, different values, opposing desires. We contain parts that want security and parts that crave freedom, aspects that seek connection and aspects that need solitude, dimensions that value tradition and dimensions that demand innovation. Usually, the ego manages these conflicts, mediates between opposing forces, creates enough coherence that we can function as unified beings despite our internal multiplicity. But this coherence is always provisional, always constructed, always requiring psychological energy to maintain. When the conflicts become too intense, when the ego is weakened by stress or trauma or exhaustion, when unconscious contents accumulate too much energy, the coherence breaks down. The multiple aspects of the psyche, usually held together by the ego's organizing function, begin to act independently, to pull in different directions, to create the internal war that characterizes chaos. This fragmentation often begins with what Jung called the collision of opposites. The person has developed one side of their nature while repressing the opposite. They have identified with being strong, pushing weakness into the shadow. They have become entirely rational, denying their emotional nature. They have lived for others, suppressing their own needs and desires. This one-sided development creates increasing tension in the psyche because what has been repressed does not disappear, but accumulates energy in the unconscious, waiting for the moment when defenses weaken and it can erupt. The eruption, when it comes, feels like chaos because consciousness is not prepared for it, has no framework for integrating what has been denied. The strong person is suddenly overwhelmed by feelings of vulnerability they cannot control. The rational person is flooded with emotions they do not understand. The self-sacrificing person is seized by rage at those they have served. These are not external attacks, but internal revolts, the rejected aspects of self-demanding recognition. Inner chaos also emerges during transitions, during what Jung called individuation crises. These are the moments when the self we have been is no longer adequate, when we must transform to continue developing, when old identities must die so new ones can emerge. Midlife crisis is the most recognized form, but individuation crises can happen at any age, when the role we have played no longer fits, when the values we lived by no longer convince us, when the meaning that sustained us evaporates, when we glimpse possibilities of being that contradict everything we have constructed. These transitions are chaotic because we must let go before we know what we are reaching for, must dissolve old forms before new ones have crystallized, must endure a period of not knowing, of being unformed, of having no stable ground. The mystics called this the dark night of the soul. Psychologically, it is the period when chaos reigns, because old order has collapsed and new order has not yet emerged. Trauma also creates inner chaos, particularly when the trauma is developmental or relational rather than a single event. Complex trauma, as psychologist Judith Herman describes it, fractures the psyche in specific ways. The person develops different selves for different contexts, a compliant self for threatening situations, a withdrawn self for protection, a false self for social interaction, a true self that remains hidden. These selves often have limited awareness of each other, limited ability to communicate, and when circumstances trigger shifts between them, the experience is of chaos, of not knowing who you are, of sudden shifts in mood and behavior that feel uncontrolled. The chaos of trauma is different from the chaos of individuation. Trauma chaos is earlier, more fundamental, involves the failure to develop basic coherence rather than the breakdown of achieved coherence. But both share the quality of fragmentation, of internal experience that does not cohere, of being at war with oneself without knowing how to achieve peace. Inner chaos also has a physiological dimension. The nervous system, when dysregulated by stress or trauma or overwhelm, creates subjective experience of chaos. The sympathetic activation of anxiety makes thoughts race, makes focus impossible, makes everything feel urgent and threatening. The dorsal vagal shutdown of depression makes everything feel flat, makes motivation disappear, makes even basic functioning feel impossible. The oscillation between these states creates chaos of its own. Not knowing what you will feel from moment to moment, not being able to trust your own responses, feeling controlled by biological forces you cannot regulate. Modern psychology recognizes this as emotion dysregulation, the inability to modulate emotional responses, to maintain equilibrium, to return to baseline after activation. The person experiencing dysregulation feels chaotic because their internal state is chaotic, shifting rapidly without apparent cause, overwhelming their capacity to cope, creating feedback loops where anxiety about dysregulation creates more dysregulation. But Jung's insight was that chaos is not only pathological, it is also creative, is the necessary precondition for transformation, is what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution that must occur before new synthesis becomes possible. Chaos destroys what has become rigid, breaks down structures that no longer serve, creates space for reorganization at a higher level of complexity and integration. This does not make chaos comfortable or safe. It is genuinely dangerous, can lead to psychosis, to suicide, to lasting fragmentation if not navigated carefully. But it is also potentially creative, potentially transformative, potentially the very thing needed when development has stalled, when the psyche has become frozen in patterns that prevent growth. Understanding inner chaos therefore requires holding both truths. It is breakdown and it is breakthrough. It is destruction and it is creation. It is danger and it is opportunity. The question is not whether to avoid chaos, which is often impossible, but how to navigate it, how to endure it without being destroyed, how to allow the necessary dissolution while maintaining enough coherence to eventually reorganize at a higher level. The unconscious erupting, what we cannot control. The most disorienting aspect of inner chaos is the experience of being overtaken by forces that seem beyond conscious control. Thoughts appear that we did not choose to think. Emotions surge that we cannot justify or explain. Impulses arise that contradict our values and intentions. Dreams become vivid and disturbing, carrying messages we cannot decode. The boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes permeable in ways that feel dangerous, as if the unconscious is flooding consciousness, overwhelming the ego's capacity to organize and direct experience. Jung understood the unconscious not as a repository of repressed content, but as an autonomous dimension of the psyche, with its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own energy that can overwhelm consciousness when it becomes too powerful or when consciousness becomes too weak. The unconscious is not passive but active, not empty but full, not simply what we have forgotten but what we have never known. The vast dimension of psychic life that operates beneath awareness, shaping our behavior and experience in ways we do not consciously recognize. When the unconscious erupts into consciousness, it does not arrive as coherent information, but as symbols, as emotions, as compulsions, as disturbances that consciousness struggles to integrate. Jung called these eruptions complexes, autonomous splinters of psyche with their own emotional charge, their own logic, their own capacity to seize control of consciousness. We experience complexes as being possessed, as suddenly not being ourselves, as acting or feeling or thinking in ways that seem foreign to our usual character. The person seized by a rage complex does not choose to be angry. The rage comes from somewhere deeper, takes over, acts through them, while the ego watches helplessly or rationalizes the behavior afterwards. The person overtaken by anxiety does not decide to be afraid. The fear wells up from the unconscious, floods the nervous system, creates thoughts that justify the anxiety but do not actually cause it. The person gripped by desire does not consciously choose the obsession. The desire possesses them, reorganizes their priorities, makes everything else seem irrelevant. These possessions create inner chaos because consciousness loses its organizing function, becomes a passenger rather than a driver, watches itself acting in ways it does not understand or condone. The person experiencing this feels they are going crazy, feels they are losing control, feels they can no longer trust themselves, and in a sense they are right. The ego's control is revealed as partial, as provisional, as something that can be overridden by forces from the unconscious that have their own power and their own agenda. But Jung insisted that these eruptions, however chaotic, are not meaningless. The unconscious is trying to communicate something that consciousness has been refusing to hear, is compensating for consciousness's one-sidedness, is forcing attention to what has been neglected or denied. The rage complex may be carrying legitimate anger that the person has never allowed themselves to feel. The anxiety may be pointing to real dangers that consciousness has been minimizing. The desire may be revealing needs that have been suppressed in service of other people's expectations. The chaos of unconscious eruption is therefore purposeful chaos, is the psyche's crude attempt at self-correction, at restoring balance, at forcing development that consciousness has been resisting. This does not make it less frightening or less disruptive, but it means that simply suppressing the eruption, simply trying to regain control without understanding what the unconscious is trying to communicate, will likely lead to more severe eruptions later, to increasing chaos as the unconscious intensifies its efforts to be heard. Dreams become particularly intense during periods of inner chaos because the unconscious uses dreams to communicate what consciousness cannot or will not acknowledge directly. The dreams of someone experiencing inner chaos are often vivid, disturbing, filled with images of destruction, of pursuit, of falling, of being overwhelmed. Jung taught that these dreams should not be dismissed as merely anxiety dreams, but should be attended to as communications from the unconscious about what is happening in the psyche. A recurring dream of a house falling apart may represent the psychic structures that are collapsing. A dream of being chased by a threatening figure may represent the shadow, the rejected aspects of self that consciousness has been fleeing but that are now catching up. A dream of drowning may represent the experience of being overwhelmed by unconscious contents, of consciousness losing its footing in the flood of material it cannot integrate. Working with these dreams, attending to their symbolism rather than dismissing them, can help consciousness understand what the unconscious is trying to communicate, can begin the process of integration that transforms chaos into growth. But this requires a particular attitude, what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the willingness to treat unconscious material as meaningful rather than as pathological, as communication rather than as symptom. The unconscious also erupts through the body. Psychosomatic symptoms, illnesses without clear physical cause, pain that moves around and defies medical explanation. These are often the unconscious speaking through the body when consciousness will not listen. The migraine that appears before every important decision, the stomach pain that comes with certain relationships, the fatigue that has no medical basis, these may be the unconscious saying no, may be the body expressing what consciousness cannot acknowledge. Jung recognized that the psyche and soma are not separate, but aspects of one reality, that what cannot be processed psychologically often manifests physically, that the body carries what consciousness rejects. The chaos of physical symptoms without clear cause is often psychological chaos. Taking somatic form is the unconscious using the only language left when consciousness has become too defended to hear psychological communication. Synchronicity, Jung's concept of meaningful coincidence, also intensifies during periods of inner chaos. The external world begins to mirror internal states in ways that seem impossible to explain causally. The person thinking obsessively about a relationship receives an unexpected call from that person. The person struggling with a decision encounters a series of signs that seem to point in a particular direction. The person in crisis repeatedly encounters the same symbol or image in different contexts. Jung believed these synchronicities occur when the boundary between inner and outer becomes thin, when the unconscious has accumulated enough energy that it begins to affect not just the person's internal experience, but their external reality. Whether or not one accepts Jung's metaphysical explanation, the phenomenology is real. During periods of inner chaos, the world often seems to speak, to reflect back our internal state, to participate in the psychic drama we are living through. This participation of the outer world in inner chaos can intensify the sense of falling apart, can make the person feel they cannot trust their perception of reality, can create the paranoid sense that everything is connected, that nothing is coincidence, that the world is organized around their psychic state. This is dangerous territory, is close to psychosis, is where inner chaos becomes so extreme that the distinction between inner and outer collapses entirely. Fragmentation, living as multiple selves. One of the most destabilizing aspects of inner chaos is the experience of fragmentation, the sense that you are not one unified self but multiple selves that do not know each other, do not communicate, sometimes do not even share memories. You wake up one morning feeling confident, capable, ready to engage with life. By afternoon, without clear external cause, you feel small, vulnerable, incapable of the most basic tasks. The shift is not gradual but sudden, as if you have become a different person, as if the self you were hours ago has disappeared and been replaced by someone else entirely. This fragmentation is not metaphor. Modern psychology, particularly internal family systems therapy developed by Richard Schwartz, recognizes that the psyche naturally organizes itself into parts, into subpersonalities that have different characteristics, different ages, different beliefs and goals. In healthy functioning, these parts communicate, work together, are organized by what IFS calls the self, the core of consciousness that can mediate between parts and maintain overall coherence. But in trauma, in overwhelm, in extreme conflict, this organization breaks down. Parts become isolated from each other, take extreme positions, refuse communication, act independently in ways that create chaos for the whole system. The part that learns to please others to stay safe conflicts with the part that rages against being used. The part that wants intimacy conflicts with the part that fears vulnerability. The part that craves success conflicts with the part that sabotages achievement to avoid the terror of visibility. These parts are not roles we consciously adopt, but genuine aspects of psyche with their own autonomy, their own emotional reality, their own logic. The people-pleasing part genuinely believes that approval is necessary for survival. The raging part genuinely believes that anger is the only protection against exploitation. The sabotaging part genuinely believes that success would bring unbearable exposure. Each part, from its own perspective, is trying to protect the whole system, trying to prevent some feared outcome, trying to ensure survival. The chaos emerges when these protective strategies conflict, when what one part needs threatens what another part is trying to protect. You want to be close to someone, so you move toward intimacy. But then the protective part that fears abandonment creates distance to prevent the anticipated rejection. You want to succeed professionally, so you work hard toward a goal. But then the part that fears visibility sabotages your efforts to keep you safe from judgment. The different parts pull you in opposite directions simultaneously, creating paralysis, creating the sense that you are at war with yourself and cannot win. Dissociation is the extreme form of this fragmentation. In dissociation, the separation between parts becomes so complete that one part has no memory of what another part experienced or did. The person might lose time, might find evidence of activities they do not remember, might be told by others about behavior that seems completely foreign to them. This is not conscious lying or manipulation, but genuine fragmentation, the psyche's most extreme protective mechanism, creating such complete separation between parts that traumatic experience can be isolated, contained, kept from overwhelming consciousness. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder, represents the most severe form of this fragmentation, where different parts have developed into what seem like completely different personalities, with different names, different ages, different memories and abilities. But DID exists on a continuum with less severe forms of fragmentation that many people experience, where the separation between parts is not absolute but significant enough to create substantial inner chaos. Even without formal dissociation, many people experience their inner multiplicity as chaos. They do not recognize themselves in their own behavior, do not understand why they keep doing what they do not want to do, feel they are multiple people rather than one coherent self. Who am I? Becomes not a philosophical question but an urgent psychological one. Which of these parts is the real me? Or am I just a collection of parts with no core self at all? Jung understood this fragmentation through his concept of complexes, those autonomous splinters of psyche that can act independently. But he also believed in what he called the self, spelled with a capital S, the archetype of wholeness that exists beyond the ego, that is not created by integration but discovered through it. The self is already whole, already contains all the parts. The work is not creating unity but recognizing the unity that exists beneath the apparent fragmentation. This is radically different from seeing fragmentation as pathology to be eliminated. From Jung's perspective, the multiplicity is natural, is the structure of the psyche itself. The problem is not that we contain multiple parts, but that consciousness is not related properly to them, that the ego has identified with some parts while rejecting others, that the organizing function of the self has been lost and needs to be rediscovered. The exhaustion of fragmentation is profound. Managing multiple parts that do not communicate, that pull in different directions, that undermine each other's efforts, requires enormous psychological energy. The person experiencing this fragmentation is constantly mediating internal conflicts, constantly trying to hold together what is pulling apart, constantly attempting to present a coherent self to the world while internally experiencing chaos. This exhaustion is compounded by shame. The person feels they should be able to control themselves, should be able to maintain consistency, should be able to stop the internal war through willpower or determination. They judge themselves for their contradictions, for saying one thing and doing another, for having feelings and desires that contradict each other. But willpower does not work with fragmentation, because will comes from the ego, and the ego is not strong enough to control parts that have their own autonomy, their own energy, their own protective purposes. What is needed instead is what IFS calls self-energy, the qualities of curiosity, compassion, calm, courage that emerge when we can access the core self that exists beyond the parts. From self, we can relate to the parts without being overwhelmed by them, can understand their protective purposes without being controlled by them, can appreciate their efforts while also setting boundaries when their strategies create more harm than good. But accessing self-energy during periods of intense chaos is difficult. The parts are loud, are urgent, are convinced that their way is the only way to survive. The self's voice is quieter, requires space and stillness to hear, requires stepping back from the immediate conflict to find the perspective that can hold all parts with compassion while not being identified with any single one. Fragmentation is therefore both the problem and the pointer towards solution. The chaos of multiple conflicting parts is real, is painful, is disabling, but it also reveals that we are larger than any single part, that beneath the fragmentation exists something more fundamental, that the work is not eliminating parts, but learning to relate to them from a different center, from the self that can hold the multiplicity without being torn apart by it. The creative power of chaos, destruction as transformation. There is a paradox at the heart of inner chaos that conventional psychology often misses. Destruction can be creative. Breakdown can be breakthrough. Falling apart can be the necessary precondition for coming together in a more integrated way. The alchemists understood this through their symbolism of the nigredo, the blackening, the stage where all previous forms dissolve into prima materia, into chaotic base matter, before the work of transformation can truly begin. What looks like regression, like failure, like descent into madness, may actually be the psyche's attempt to reorganize itself at a higher level of complexity. Jung was fascinated by alchemy precisely because it provided a symbolic language for understanding psychological transformation. The alchemists were not simply trying to turn lead into gold, but were projecting their own psychological processes onto matter, were describing through chemical metaphors the stages through which the psyche must pass to achieve wholeness. And the first stage, the most necessary stage, was dissolution, was chaos, was the breaking down of all existing structures so that something genuinely new could emerge. This creative destruction is why individuation often begins with crisis, with the collapse of the life one has carefully constructed, with the failure of the identity one has worked so hard to maintain. The successful professional who suddenly cannot get out of bed, the devoted parent whose children leave and who discovers they do not know who they are without that role, the person who has lived according to external expectations, who wakes up one day and realizes they have been living someone else's life. These crises are not failures, but the psyche's way of forcing transformation, of making continued existence in the old form impossible so that new forms can emerge. Mythology is filled with stories of descent, of heroes who must journey to the underworld, must face death, must lose everything before they can return transformed. Inanna descending through the 7 gates, stripped of all her powers and adornments, Persephone dragged into Hades, Jonah in the belly of the whale, Christ in the tomb. These are not punishment narratives, but transformation narratives, describing the necessary descent into darkness, into chaos, into death that precedes rebirth. Psychologically, this descent is into the unconscious, into the parts of ourselves we have rejected, into the shadow we have denied, into the chaos we have been holding at bay through rigid defenses and carefully maintained identities. The descent is terrifying because it means letting go of control, means surrendering to forces larger than the ego, means accepting that we do not know who we will be on the other side of this passage. But Jung insisted that this descent is where the treasure is found. What we most need is buried in what we most fear, is hidden in the darkness we have been fleeing, is waiting in the chaos we have been trying to prevent. The gold of the alchemists, the treasure of mythology, the pearl of great price in religious tradition all point to the same psychological truth. Wholeness requires reclaiming what has been rejected, requires integrating what has been split off, requires making conscious what has been unconscious. This is why symptoms, disturbing as they are, can be viewed not as things to eliminate, but as messages to decode. The anxiety that prevents you from continuing on your current path may be the psyche's way of saying, this path is not yours. This life you are living is not aligned with who you actually are. The depression that makes previous sources of meaning feel empty may be the psyche forcing you to find deeper meaning, to stop avoiding the existential questions you have been suppressing. The rage that erupts may be carrying legitimate grievances that you have never allowed yourself to acknowledge. The creative power of chaos is that it breaks down what has become rigid, what has become false, what has become a prison masquerading as protection. The person who has lived their entire life in control, who has managed every situation, who has never allowed themselves vulnerability, may need the chaos of losing control to discover that they can survive it, that vulnerability is not death, that there is life beyond the rigid structures they have built. The person who has always been good, who has suppressed their shadow completely, who has identified entirely with light and morality, may need the chaos of shadow eruption to discover that they are more than their persona, that wholeness includes darkness, that being good is less important than being real. The breakdown of the false self, however painful, creates space for the true self to emerge. This is what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, what spiritual traditions recognize as the necessary stage of purgation, of stripping away everything false, everything constructed, everything that is not essential. St. John of the Cross described it as the soul in darkness, stripped of all consolations, all certainties, all the usual supports, left naked and alone. But this darkness is not punishment, it is preparation, is the clearing away of what must go before the genuinely new can arrive. Modern psychology often pathologizes this process, sees crisis as disease rather than as potential development, treats the symptoms as problems to eliminate rather than as communications to understand. Medication can certainly help manage overwhelming distress, can create enough stability that the person can do the psychological work required. But medication alone, without the psychological engagement with what the chaos is revealing, risks simply suppressing the symptoms without addressing the underlying need for transformation. Jung warned against what he called premature restoration of the persona, the attempt to return to how things were before the chaos, to rebuild the old identity, to suppress the unconscious contents that have erupted. This may provide temporary relief, but at the cost of the transformation the psyche was attempting, at the cost of the development that can only happen through dissent, through chaos, through the dissolution that allows reorganization at a higher level. The creative power of chaos is therefore not automatic, not guaranteed. Chaos can destroy without creating, can lead to lasting fragmentation rather than to integration, can overwhelm the ego completely rather than transforming it. The difference depends on whether consciousness can maintain some presence during the chaos, can witness without being completely identified, can hold enough stability to allow the dissolution while not being destroyed by it. This requires what the alchemists called the container, the vessel that holds the chaotic materials while transformation occurs. Psychologically, the container might be therapy, might be supportive relationships, might be creative practice, might be spiritual discipline. Without a container, chaos simply disperses, simply destroys, leads to fragmentation rather than transformation. With a container, chaos becomes the raw material from which something new can be created. The dark night, when chaos becomes crisis. There is a difference between chaos that transforms and chaos that destroys, between the dissolution that precedes integration and the fragmentation that leads to psychosis, between the dark night of the soul and the descent into madness from which there is no return. Understanding this difference is crucial because while inner chaos can be creative, it can also be genuinely dangerous, can lead to suicide, to lasting damage, to permanent disconnection from reality. Not all breakdowns lead to breakthroughs. Some simply break. The signs that chaos has crossed into crisis are specific and should not be ignored. When the person loses the ability to function in basic ways, cannot work, cannot maintain relationships, cannot care for themselves physically, the chaos has become too extreme. When thoughts become genuinely delusional, when the person believes things that are clearly contradicted by reality and cannot be convinced otherwise, when they hear voices or see things that are not there, the boundary between inner and outer has collapsed in dangerous ways. When suicidal ideation moves from passive wishes to active planning, when the person has access to means and has begun taking steps toward ending their life, this is emergency. The pain of inner chaos can become so extreme, the fragmentation so complete, the sense of being trapped in unbearable internal experience so absolute, that death appears as the only escape. This is not philosophical contemplation of mortality, but acute crisis requiring immediate intervention. Jung was deeply concerned about this edge between creative chaos and psychotic breakdown. He himself had experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner chaos following his break with Freud, during which he had visions, heard voices, experienced the kind of internal dissolution that could have led to psychosis. Jung navigated this period through what he called active imagination, deliberately engaging with the unconscious contents rather than being passively overwhelmed by them, maintaining enough ego strength to witness the chaos without being completely identified with it. But Jung had resources many people do not have: intellectual understanding of what was happening, social and professional stability, a strong ego developed through years of successful functioning. For someone without these resources, someone whose ego is already fragile, someone without support systems or understanding, the same kind of unconscious eruption can lead not to transformation but to lasting damage, to hospitalization, to chronic dysfunction. The risk factors for chaos becoming crisis include history of trauma, particularly early developmental trauma that prevented the formation of basic ego stability. The person whose psyche fractured early, who developed through dissociation rather than integration, who never had the experience of secure attachment that creates foundational sense of self, this person is more vulnerable when chaos erupts. Their ego is not strong enough to contain the dissolution, their parts are too separate to communicate, their ability to distinguish inner from outer is too fragile. Isolation intensifies danger. The person experiencing chaos alone, without relationships that can provide reality testing, without people who can recognize when they are losing touch, without support that can help them maintain basic functioning, is at much greater risk. The chaos feeds on itself, creates paranoid thinking, makes the person withdraw further, intensifies the sense that they are losing their mind and cannot tell anyone because it would prove they are crazy. Substance use during periods of inner chaos is particularly dangerous. Drugs and alcohol that might provide temporary relief from the intensity of internal experience often make the chaos worse, lower defenses further, can trigger psychotic episodes in vulnerable individuals. The person trying to self-medicate their way through chaos often finds themselves deeper in crisis, with additional problems layered on top of the psychological turmoil they were trying to escape. This is when professional help is not optional but necessary. Therapy can provide the container that allows chaos to be transformative rather than destructive, can offer the relationship that maintains reality testing, can help the person distinguish between unconscious material that needs to be integrated and symptoms that need to be treated. The right therapist, particularly one trained in working with trauma and dissociation, can help the person navigate chaos without being destroyed by it. Medication may also be necessary. not as avoidance of psychological work, but as support that makes psychological work possible. The person whose anxiety is so extreme they cannot sleep, whose depression is so severe they cannot function, whose dissociation is so complete they lose time regularly, this person may need pharmacological support to create enough stability that they can engage with the underlying psychological issues. Medication is not the solution, but can be part of the support structure that allows the real work to happen. Hospitalization, though frightening and stigmatized, can be life-saving when chaos has become crisis. When someone is actively suicidal, when they have become psychotic, when they cannot maintain basic safety, the controlled environment of a psychiatric unit can provide the intense support needed to prevent death or permanent damage. This is not failure, but recognition that chaos has exceeded what can be navigated alone or even with outpatient support. The spiritual traditions that speak of the dark night of the soul also speak of guidance, of teachers who have navigated this territory, of practices that provide structure during dissolution. The mystics who experience profound inner chaos did so within communities, with mentors, with shared language and maps for understanding what was happening. They did not navigate the darkness alone, even though the darkness itself was solitary, even though no one could walk the path for them. Modern people experiencing inner chaos often lack these supports. They do not have spiritual communities that recognize crisis as potential transformation. They do not have elders who have been through similar passages and can provide guidance. They do not have cultural frameworks that distinguish between mental illness requiring treatment and spiritual crisis requiring different kinds of support. This absence makes chaos more dangerous, makes the person more likely to pathologize their experience, to feel they are simply going crazy rather than going through something. But resources exist for those who seek them. Therapists trained in Jungian psychology, in internal family systems, in somatic approaches to trauma, in transpersonal psychology, these practitioners understand that chaos can be transformative and know how to provide support that allows transformation rather than simply suppressing symptoms. Spiritual directors, particularly those trained in discernment, can help distinguish between psychological crisis requiring clinical intervention and spiritual crisis requiring different support. The key is recognizing when help is needed, recognizing that the chaos has crossed into territory too dangerous to navigate alone, recognizing that asking for help is not weakness but wisdom. The person who recognizes they are in over their head, who reaches out before they are completely overwhelmed, who accepts support even though it means admitting vulnerability, this person increases dramatically their chances of chaos, leading to transformation rather than destruction. But this requires fighting against shame, against the belief that they should be able to handle this alone, against the fear that seeking help means they are broken or crazy or weak. It requires recognizing that inner chaos severe enough to threaten functioning, severe enough to make suicide seem reasonable, severe enough to disconnect from reality, is not something anyone should navigate alone, is not weakness to ask for help, but strength to recognize when help is needed. From chaos to integration, making meaning from disorder. The question that matters most to someone experiencing inner chaos is not why is this happening, but how do I navigate this? How do I survive this? How do I emerge from this not destroyed but transformed? The answer is not simple, because chaos by definition resists simple solutions, resists the kind of linear problem solving that works for ordinary difficulties. Navigating chaos requires different capacities, different attitudes, different strategies than managing normal life challenges. The first requirement is acceptance, not in the sense of liking what is happening, but in the sense of acknowledging that it is happening, that resistance intensifies suffering, that fighting against inner chaos often makes it worse. The person who experiences anxiety and then becomes anxious about being anxious creates a feedback loop that amplifies the original distress. The person who fragments and then judges themselves for fragmenting adds shame to chaos, making integration more difficult. Acceptance means recognizing what is, without adding the layer of judgment and resistance that turns pain into suffering. This acceptance is extraordinarily difficult because chaos feels like emergency, feels like something that must be fixed immediately, feels like danger requiring action. The instinct is to fight, to control, to make it stop. But chaos often cannot be controlled directly, cannot be stopped through willpower, cannot be fixed through the same rational processes that work for ordinary problems. What is required instead is what Buddhism calls radical acceptance, the willingness to be with what is, to allow the experience without immediately trying to change it. But acceptance does not mean passivity. It means engaging with chaos differently, working with it rather than against it, using its energy rather than trying to suppress it. This requires what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the willingness to treat chaotic experience as meaningful rather than as merely pathological, as communication rather than as symptom, as the psyche's attempt to reorganize rather than as breakdown, requiring only restoration of previous functioning. Engaging symbolically means paying attention to dreams, to slips of tongue, to what emerges when defenses are down, to what the body is expressing through symptoms, to what synchronicities might be revealing. It means asking not just what is wrong, but what is trying to happen. Not just how do I stop this, but what is this chaos trying to teach me? What aspect of myself is demanding recognition? What transformation is this dissolution preparing? Journaling becomes crucial during chaos because it externalizes internal experience, creates some distance from overwhelming thoughts and feelings, allows patterns to become visible that remain hidden when everything stays internal. The act of writing, of putting experience into language, begins the process of creating meaning from chaos, begins organizing what feels formless, begins the movement from being possessed by experience to being able to witness it. Creative expression in any form, art, music, movement, serves similar function. Chaos that cannot be verbalized can often be expressed through other mediums, can be given form that makes it more bearable, that begins the process of integration. The painting that expresses what words cannot capture, the music that gives voice to wordless pain, the dance that allows the body to express what consciousness cannot articulate. These become bridges between chaos and meaning. The practice of parts work, whether through formal therapy or through self-guided exploration, helps address fragmentation directly. When chaos involves conflicting parts, pulling in different directions, learning to identify these parts, to hear their concerns, to understand their protective purposes, begins to transform war into dialogue. The part that creates anxiety is trying to protect. The part that sabotages is trying to prevent feared outcomes. When these parts can be heard with compassion rather than fought with willpower, integration becomes possible. Somatic practices, working directly with the body rather than only with mind, address the physiological dimension of chaos. Breathwork, yoga, somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, these approaches recognize that chaos lives in the nervous system as much as in the mind, that regulation of the body supports regulation of consciousness. The person who can bring their nervous system out of chronic activation or shutdown creates foundation for psychological integration. Spiritual practice, whether meditation, prayer, ritual, or contemplation, can provide the transcendent perspective that prevents complete identification with chaos. The part of consciousness that can witness the chaos, that remains aware even during turmoil, that can observe thoughts and feelings without being completely identified with them. This is what spiritual traditions call the observer, the witness, the self. Strengthening this capacity through practice creates the stability that allows chaos to transform rather than destroy. But perhaps most important is patience, the recognition that integration cannot be rushed, that transformation happens on its own timeline, that the psyche has its own wisdom about pacing. The person who tries to force integration, who becomes impatient with the process, who believes they should be through this already, creates resistance that slows the very progress they are trying to accelerate. The alchemists knew that the work could not be rushed, that each stage must be given its necessary time, that attempting to skip stages or speed the process would cause the work to fail. Psychologically, this means accepting that chaos has its own duration, that dissolution must be complete before reorganization can begin, that the dark night lasts as long as it must last, and cannot be shortened through willpower or technique. Making meaning from chaos is not something that happens during chaos, but after, in reflection, in the ability to look back and recognize what changed, what was lost that needed to be lost, what was found that could only be found through descent. The meaning is not predetermined, but created through the choices made during chaos, through how the experience is integrated, through what is done with what has been learned. Some people emerge from inner chaos with greater compassion, having faced their own suffering and recognized the suffering of others. Some emerge with greater authenticity, having been stripped of false selves and discovered who they actually are beneath the personas. Some emerge with greater wisdom, having learned that life is more complex, more mysterious, less controllable than they previously believed. The specific meaning varies, but the possibility of meaning, of chaos leading not just to survival but to growth, this possibility makes the journey bearable. Jung believed that the self that emerges from chaos is more whole than the self that entered it, not because chaos is pleasant or because suffering is good, but because chaos forces confrontation with aspects of ourselves we would otherwise avoid, forces integration of what we would otherwise keep split, forces development that comfort does not require. The person who has navigated their own inner chaos and emerged intact has achieved something that cannot be achieved through ordinary living, has developed psychological capacities that can only be forged in the fire of dissolution and reorganization. The psychology of inner chaos reveals that what appears to be breakdown can be breakthrough, that what feels like falling apart can be the necessary dissolution that precedes coming together in more integrated ways, that the psyche sometimes must destroy old forms to create space for new ones. But this is not consolation during chaos, is not comfort when the internal storm is raging, is not reassurance when fragmentation feels like annihilation. Inner chaos is genuinely difficult, genuinely painful, genuinely dangerous. It can destroy as well as transform, can lead to lasting damage as well as to growth, can fragment permanently as well as reorganize at higher levels. The difference between creative chaos and destructive chaos often depends on factors beyond individual control, the presence or absence of support, the strength or fragility of ego structures, the severity or manageability of what is erupting, the availability or absence of resources and understanding. Understanding the psychology of chaos does not eliminate the suffering, but can change relationship to it, can provide framework that makes the experience less terrifying, can offer hope that this is passage rather than destination, process rather than permanent state, knowing that chaos has patterns, has stages, has purpose, even when that purpose is not visible in the moment. This knowing can provide the thread that allows navigation through the labyrinth. The psyche is naturally oriented toward wholeness, toward integration, toward the self that includes all parts and transcends all opposites. Inner chaos is often this movement toward wholeness, encountering the obstacles we have constructed, the defenses we have built, the one-sidedness we have developed. The chaos is not the problem but the symptom, not the disease but the cure attempting to happen, not breakdown but the psyche's effort to break through what has become rigid and false. But this truth must be held carefully because it can be used to dismiss genuine suffering, to romanticize crisis, to avoid recognizing when chaos has crossed into territory requiring intervention. Not all chaos is creative. Not all dissolution leads to reorganization. Not all dark nights end in dawn. The wisdom is recognizing the difference, recognizing when chaos is developmental and when it is destructive, when it requires patience and when it requires action, when it can be navigated with support and when it requires more intensive intervention. For those in the midst of chaos, the message is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because there are no guarantees, No promises that this will definitely lead to transformation. No assurance that meaning will emerge or that suffering will end. Hopeful because many have walked this path before. Many have navigated their own inner chaos and emerged not destroyed but deepened, not broken but made more whole, not defeated but transformed. The key is not navigating alone, not trying to manage overwhelming inner experience without support, without guidance, without the container that allows chaos to be held rather than simply destructive. This means reaching out even when shame says you should handle this yourself, means accepting help even when pride says you should be stronger, means admitting vulnerability even when it feels like weakness. Inner chaos strips away the false, reveals the real, forces confrontation with what we have been avoiding. This is why it is so difficult and so necessary, so painful and so potentially transformative. We do not choose chaos, but we can choose how we engage with it, whether we resist or allow, whether we fight or witness, whether we try to force premature resolution or trust the process even when trust is difficult. The psyche knows what it is doing even when consciousness does not. The chaos that feels random often has pattern, has purpose, has direction, even when that direction is not visible from within the experience. The work is maintaining enough presence to allow the process, enough stability to endure the dissolution, enough faith to believe that what is falling apart might be making space for something that could not emerge any other way. If you are experiencing inner chaos, know that you are not alone, that what you are going through is difficult, but not necessarily pathological, that chaos can be passage rather than destination. But also know that you do not have to navigate this alone, that reaching out for support is strength, not weakness, that asking for help when chaos becomes overwhelming is wisdom, not failure. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores the depths of psychological experience without minimizing difficulty or promising easy answers, that honors chaos as potentially transformative while acknowledging its genuine dangers, that provides understanding that can help navigate inner turmoil with more awareness and less terror. Share this with someone who is struggling with inner chaos, who needs to know that fragmentation does not mean they are broken, that dissolution can precede integration, that the storm within can eventually give way to new forms of being. Share it with therapists and helpers who work with people in crisis, who need frameworks for understanding chaos that go beyond simple pathology. Leave a comment sharing your experience with inner chaos, how you navigated it, what helped, what you learned, what meaning emerged. This community exists for those willing to face the difficult territories of psychological experience, to speak honestly about chaos and crisis, to support each other through passages that must ultimately be walked alone but need not be faced in isolation. Remember, chaos is not your enemy even though it feels overwhelming. It may be the psyche's way of forcing transformation you have been resisting, of breaking down structures that no longer serve, of creating space for reorganization at higher levels. This does not make it comfortable or safe, but it means it may have purpose even when that purpose is hidden. Seek help when chaos crosses into crisis. Reach out before you are completely overwhelmed. Accept support from those who understand that chaos can be transformative, who can provide the container that allows dissolution without destruction, who can help you maintain enough stability to allow the process without being destroyed by it. If you have navigated chaos and emerged transformed, share your story. Others need to know that passage through chaos is possible, that transformation can emerge from dissolution, that the dark night eventually ends. Your experience of surviving and finding meaning can provide hope to those who are still in the midst of turmoil, still wondering if they will survive, still searching for the thread that leads through the labyrinth. The psychology of inner chaos teaches us that the psyche is deeper and more complex than we usually recognize, that transformation often requires dissolution, that becoming whole sometimes means first falling apart. This is hard teaching, offers no comfort, promises no easy passage, but it is true teaching reflects the reality of psychological development, honors the difficulty while pointing toward possibility. Your chaos matters. Your struggle is not meaningless. Your fragmentation might be the necessary breaking down that precedes more genuine integration. Hold on. Reach out. Trust the process even when trust is difficult, and know that many have walked through chaos before you and emerged not destroyed but deepened, not broken but made more authentically whole.